Okay, everybody, so we've gotten a bit of an introduction to our console log function, to the idea of numbers and strings, what we do with commenting. You can see at the end of every code sentence here, I have a semicolon. We've declared some variables, we've changed their value, and we've checked how that operates in the console log window. So we're going to do some additional work here, looking at different data types. So again, reminding you that the data type is basically like a part of speech. It's a noun or a verb or something like that. Functions very often we can think of as verbs, right? They're sets of instructions that perform tasks. Our nouns kind of take different shapes. We've got nouns that are numbers, that are strings, and now the next thing that we're going to talk about, very commonly used data type, is going to be the array. And you can think of the array as just a list, right? And we write an array very, very similarly to the way that we would write a list in English, right? So for example, I've got var sum array. I'm declaring my array, right? So I've done that thing where I said, hey, this is a variable. That means create a box in memory, set aside some space, and put the label sum array on it. And now I can go ahead here and I'm going to give it some values. Now, if I were writing the list of, say, the colors of a rainbow, for example, in English, I would write something like red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet. Whoops. Violet, right? That's the way that I would write it in English. Now, the way that I write it in code is actually going to be very similar. There's just two things that I'm going to do differently. I'm going to say, I'm going to put square brackets around it. That's a signal to my program that this is an array or a list. And of course, because these are actually strings, right? They're names of things, text. I'm going to put quotation marks around them. And you'll see that I can print this out just the way I can print out my number or anything else. So I'm just going to say console log sum array, right? Getting pretty comfortable with this now, I think. So here we go. I'm going to switch back to my web page and do this. And here we go. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue. Oops, I missed indigo, didn't I? Well, interesting. I missed indigo. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet. Now, let's say that I wanted to check and see. Now, the thing about a list is that, of course, things can have positions in a list, right? We can talk about the first item and the second item. If I were to ask you what the third item in this list is, you'd probably tell me yellow, right? And so let's go ahead and check that out, because I have a special thing that I can do with this, which is that I can ask the computer to tell me what value, right, is in a given position in the list, right? So we've got first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. So I'm going to say, hey, tell me what's at sum array, what's in the first position, right? So again, I use these square brackets. I'm saying, hey, this is how I'm going to tell you that I want you to give me the thing that's at this position is with those square brackets, and I put a 1 in there. Let's see what we get. Well, that's interesting. I asked it for the first item, but it gave me orange. So this is actually a very important aspect of arrays, and this is just one of these things about how computers are organized, and there really isn't any magic to it. So an array of strings, okay, this will print my array. This will print the item in the array that's in position 1. Now, the thing about computers is they start counting at 0. So what we would normally think of as the first item is actually going to be at position or index 0. So if I change this, I'll leave that as 1, and then I'm going to go console log sum array 0. And you notice as I do this that Aptana is doing all kinds of handy things for me. So for example, when I start typing this, it might be a little bit difficult for you guys to see. When I type this first square bracket, it actually goes ahead and adds the closing bracket as well, because it knows that this needs to be symmetrical, and so it's going to, kind of help me out there. So now I'm going to look and see what's in position 0. And in point of fact, I get what I'm looking for. Now what's interesting here too that I want to point out is that when I have it print something that is normally in quotation marks, right, it actually just prints it as plain text, whereas when I ask it to print the entire array, it actually shows me the quotation marks. And that's because arrays can have lots of different types of information in them. In fact, arrays can have, let's see, arrays can have just numbers in them. Here's a way to confuse yourself, right? I can put 5, 7, 9, right? So I can do that. I can have it print numbers, right? So what's appearing in position 1 is the number 4, position 0 is the number 1, right? That's gonna be kind of messy. So again, the thing that's important to understand about arrays is that they're basically just like lists. We separate them with commas. We're going to follow the same conventions for the data type that we're including that we want to make a list of. And so if it's going to be strings or text, we're going to wrap it in quotation marks. And if it's going to be numbers, then we'll just put numbers. There's another kind of data type that we can put into arrays as well, called objects, which we'll talk about next. But I think that the important things to take away from this is that an array is just like a list, and that we have different ways that we can access the elements of that list, the most straightforward of which is going to be to know what position in the list it's in. There are also a lot of built-in functions for dealing with arrays, so sorting functions, the same way you would think of as using in a spreadsheet, we can perform on these lists as well. We'll talk about those in more detail in the future, but just to give you guys a sense of what's possible. So right now we have data types that are lists, numbers, and strings. And the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create something called an object. Okay, so what exactly is an object? An object is a kind of open format. It's an open data type. You can think of it the way that like a book is an object, right? Or maybe a pencil or a pen. An object is basically just a thing, right? And mostly it's important that it's a thing that has properties. Right? So properties are kind of like the things that we would use as adjectives for describing it, right? Like if I were to do, let's say, an object to describe a person, then I might want to record things like their height, their gender, their hair color, their eye color, right? A property is a descriptor. Right? And those properties can have different values depending on what kind of object it is, right? So in this case, we're going to look at how we might have just sort of a generic object that's going to describe a person. We'll have properties that are valuable for describing that person, such as their name, their gender, their hair color, etc. So here we go. We're going to say some object equals, right? So remember when we were talking about our arrays, when we want to tell the computer, hey, what's coming up next is a list, we begin with a square bracket. When we want to tell it that it's an object, we begin with curly braces. And this is how we're going to organize the parts of our object. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to give it the name of the property, so the type of descriptor. So let's start with hair color. Okay? And then to give it a value, we're going to say hair color is brown, right? Very simple. We have a variable with the label some object and hair color equals brown. So let's go ahead and console log that out and see what we get. There you go. And you can see actually it's announcing to us that this is an object. So an object is considered a quote-unquote complex data type. Why? Because I get to decide what the descriptors are of an object. I can put any properties on there that I want. So the computer doesn't necessarily know what type of value to expect because we could put any kind of descriptors on an object that we decide. Whereas with some of our more basic data types like numbers, strings, arrays, it doesn't even bother telling us what type of object it is because it's such a fundamental type that it doesn't need to explain it. So the other thing is that my objects can have multiple properties. So I've got hair color, let's say name, right? Name's a good one. In this case, the name is Susan. So I've added a property to my object, right? It's simply a list. So we call this the key and the value. Why do we call it a key? Well, if we were talking about an array, right, we can think of this as being, having a position in a list, right? Obviously, there's commas between these two sets of descriptors or properties. So you can think of hair color as being the first element and name as being the second element, second property. But objects don't work that way. With objects, when we want to get the value, right, we need to ask for the value by naming the key that it's assigned to. So in this case, we're going to actually say, instead of saying we want the entire object, when we say some object, it's going to give us the entire object. If we want just a certain property from that object, we can say some object dot hair color. Okay? So that's how we're going to get the value associated with the key called hair color that is part of some object. So again, if I come here, there we go. And now you can see that we're back down to a simple data type, which is a string, because the value that's stored on hair color is a string. And therefore, it's just going to sort of print out that way. Okay, we're going to come back in another couple of minutes with just a few wrap-up details, and then we'll be done with our sort of basic data types and console log exercise.